The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on James Harrington's weathered face as he guided his dun-colored stallion across the dusty plains of Apache County. At 47, the lines etched around his eyes told stories of hardship and triumph in equal measure. His calloused hands, marked by years of roping cattle and gripping revolvers, rested casually on the horn of his saddle as he surveyed the land that had become his reluctant home. The war between the states had left him with nightmares and a Sharps rifle he couldn't bring himself to part with. But 15 years of ranching in the Southwest had gradually softened the harder edges of his Virginia upbringing. His small spread, nestled between the imposing White Mountains and the unforgiving desert, wasn't much compared to the cattle empires further east, but it was his, paid for with sweat and determination rather than blood. As the golden afternoon light painted the distant mesas in hues of amber and crimson, James's thoughts drifted to Morning Star, the Apache woman who had saved his life during a violent fever 2 winters past. Their secret meetings at the hidden spring beyond Rattlesnake Ridge had become the compass point around which his life quietly revolved. Though no one in Cottonwood Springs would ever suspect that the respected rancher harbored such forbidden feelings. The town of Cottonwood Springs had sprouted from the desert floor like an unlikely flower after the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad established a depot there in 1878. What had begun as a dusty collection of tents and hastily constructed wooden buildings had, over 7 years, transformed into a proper frontier settlement, complete with a mercantile, livery stable, 2 competing saloons, a small church, and Maggie's Cafe, where Elizabeth Lizzie Crawford had served the best apple pie in 3 counties for the past 4 years. At 32, Lizzie's honey-blonde hair and quick smile had drawn marriage proposals from half the eligible men in town, but she had eyes only for the quiet rancher who came in every Saturday for coffee and pie, leaving generous tips and sparse conversation in his wake. The worn, leather-bound copy of Thoreau's Walden she had once spotted peeking from his saddlebag had surprised her, hinting at depths she longed to explore. Unlike the rowdy cowboys and ambitious merchants who frequented her cafe, James Harrington carried himself with a dignified reserve that spoke of education and principles, qualities that had become increasingly rare on the frontier. Today was Saturday, and as she wiped down the rough-hewn tables in preparation for the lunch rush, her heart quickened at the thought of his imminent arrival, unaware that his path to town had temporarily diverted toward the Apache reservation. Morning Star moved silently through the juniper grove, her deerskin moccasins making no sound on the needle-covered earth. At 29, she possessed a fierce beauty that matched her intellect, high cheekbones, obsidian eyes that missed nothing, and raven hair pulled back in a practical braid that reached the small of her back. The daughter of a respected medicine man, she had grown up straddling 2 worlds, learning the ancient ways of her people while serving as interpreter for the reservation agent due to her exceptional facility with English. Acquired during 3 bitter years at a Pennsylvania mission school, the white man's language had been beaten into her as a child, but she had transformed this imposed knowledge into power, becoming an essential intermediary between her tribe and the encroaching settlers. The small leather pouch of healing herbs at her waist swung gently as she made her way toward the hidden spring, her sanctum of peace and, more recently, the forbidden meeting place where she and the tall rancher had cautiously built a bridge between their separate worlds. Their connection had begun with medicine and gratitude, but had evolved into something neither had anticipated, something that brought equal measures of joy and danger. As she settled on a sun-warmed rock beside the crystalline pool, Morning Star closed her eyes and listened to the wind, sensing that today would bring a turning point in the careful balance she had maintained between duty to her people and the feelings that had taken root in her heart. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood adjusted his Stetson against the glare as he completed his morning rounds through Cottonwood Springs. At 53, The former Texas Ranger had seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, and he valued the relative tranquility of the growing settlement he had sworn to protect. His silver-streaked beard and the Colt peacemaker holstered at his hip commanded respect without requiring demonstration, though everyone in town knew he could still outshoot men half his age when necessary. As he passed Maggie's cafe, he tipped his hat to Lizzie, who was arranging fresh wildflowers on the windowsill. "Beautiful morning, Miss Crawford," he called, noting the flush that colored her cheeks at his greeting. Blackwood had observed her infatuation with James Harrington over many months and felt a paternal concern for the kind-hearted Waitress. The sheriff counted Harrington among his few genuine friends in the territory, a man who could be trusted to stand on the right side when trouble came calling. But he also knew secrets about the rancher's comings and goings that would shatter Lizzie's romantic notions. Rumors had reached him through his Navajo deputy about a white rancher meeting with an Apache woman, and while Blackwood held no personal prejudice against such arrangements, he knew that territorial sentiment against squaw men could turn violent without warning. As he continued his patrol toward the telegraph office, the sheriff mentally rehearsed the warning he intended to deliver to his friend when next they spoke, unaware that events were already in motion that would soon test the limits of justice and mercy in Cottonwood Springs. The cattleman's saloon buzzed with the usual Saturday activity, poker games in full swing, whiskey flowing freely, and the tinny sounds of a slightly out-of-tune piano providing accompaniment to the boisterous conversations. Elijah Stanton, owner of the sprawling S-Bar-S ranch that dominated the Eastern Valley, held court at his regular table near the bar. At 61, the cattle baron's immaculately trimmed white beard and tailored Eastern suits set him apart from the cowhands and settlers who populated the frontier town. 3 decades of ruthless business decisions had transformed his initial modest holdings into an empire, and he had long since stopped distinguishing between the concepts of wealth and righteousness. To Stanton's mind, his success proved divine favor, and this conviction allowed him to pursue his interests with an untroubled conscience. His cold blue eyes narrowed as James Harrington entered the saloon, removing his dust-covered hat and nodding politely to the bartender. "Harrington," Stanton called, gesturing imperiously to an empty chair at his table. "Join us for a moment. I have a business proposition that might interest a man in your position." The barely concealed condescension in his tone revealed his true assessment of the smaller ranchers. With a carefully neutral expression, he altered his course towards Stanton's table, unaware that the conversation about to unfold would set in motion a chain of events that would force a reckoning with the carefully compartmentalized aspects of his life. "Water rights," Stanton declared without preamble as James settled into the offered chair, declining with a small gesture the whiskey pushed toward him. "The future of this territory belongs to those who control the water, and that sorry excuse for a creek that runs through your property has become unexpectedly valuable." The cattle baron's smile didn't reach his eyes as he continued, outlining a proposal that amounted to highway robbery disguised as generosity, an offer to purchase James's ranch for a fraction of its worth, with the apparent magnanimity of allowing him to remain as foreman. Several of Stanton's associates, including his son-in-law William Fletcher, who served as county commissioner, nodded in sage agreement as the older man spoke. James listened silently, his expression betraying nothing of the calculations racing through his mind. His modest ranch stood between Stanton's massive holdings and the unclaimed territorial land to the west, land that would become immensely valuable once the planned reservoir project diverted water from the mountains. It wasn't the first time the cattle baron had attempted to absorb his property, but the thinly veiled threat underlying today's offer felt different. "I appreciate your interest, Mr. Stanton," James finally responded, his Virginia accent slightly more pronounced than usual. "But as I've mentioned before, I have no intention of selling. If you'll excuse me, I have business at the Mercantile before heading back." As he stood and replaced his hat, James caught the flash of cold fury in Stanton's eyes, quickly masked behind a veneer of frontier bonhomie. "Think carefully, Harrington," the older man called after him. "A man in this country needs friends more than pride. Isn't that right, Sheriff?" James turned to find Thomas Blackwood standing just inside the batwing doors, his weathered face unreadable as the implied threat hung in the air between them. Later that afternoon, as the desert heat began its gradual retreat toward evening coolness, James sat across from Sheriff Blackwood in the relative privacy of Maggie's cafe. Lizzie had fussed over their table, bringing fresh coffee and 2 generous slices of apple pie before reluctantly turning her attention to other customers. "She's sweet on you, James," Blackwood observed after she moved out of earshot. "Has been for years now. Might do you good to consider settling down with a respectable woman." The emphasis on the word respectable wasn't lost on James, who met his friend's gaze steadily. "I assume there's a reason for this conversation, Tom," he said quietly, his fork suspended above the untouched pie. The sheriff sighed, leaning forward to keep his voice below the ambient chatter of the cafe. "Word gets around, even when folks think they're being careful. Your visits to the reservation boundary haven't gone unnoticed, and with tensions already high after that business with the stolen cattle last month." He let the sentence trail off, meaningfully. James's face remained impassive, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. "I've hired Apache trackers for years. Nothing unusual about consulting with people who know the territory." Blackwood shook his head slightly. "We've been friends too long for that kind of talk, James. I don't give a damn about who you choose to spend time with. But others will, especially now that you're standing in Stanton's way. He's looking for leverage, and a white rancher with an Apache woman would be just the kind of scandal he needs to undermine your standing." James stared into his coffee cup, the implications settling heavily on his shoulders. "I appreciate the warning," he finally said, his voice barely audible above the clatter of dishes and conversation. As dusk painted the western sky in watercolor shades of orange and purple, Lizzie finished wiping down the last table at Maggie's cafe. The conversation between James and the sheriff had left her troubled, though she had managed to catch only fragments despite her best efforts to linger within earshot. The bell above the door jingled softly as William Fletcher entered, removing his bowler hat with practiced courtesy. As county commissioner and Elijah Stanton's son-in-law, Fletcher carried himself with the peculiar blend of obsequiousness toward his powerful father-in-law and arrogance toward everyone else. "Miss Crawford," he greeted her with an oily smile that never reached his calculating eyes. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a cup of coffee before you close. The evening commission meeting promises to be tediously long." Lizzie nodded politely, though she had little liking for the man whose political maneuverings typically aligned perfectly with Stanton's business interests. As she poured his coffee, Fletcher casually remarked, "I couldn't help but notice your special attention to Mr. Harrington earlier. A word of friendly advice: you might wish to set your sights elsewhere. The man has entanglements that would shock a decent woman such as yourself." Lizzie's hand trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot, her mind racing to interpret his insinuation. "Mr. Harrington's affairs are his own business," she replied with forced composure. Fletcher's smile widened unpleasantly as he stirred sugar into his cup. "For now, perhaps. But secrets have a way of becoming very public in small communities like ours, especially scandalous ones involving certain native women from the reservation." Night had fully descended by the time James reached his ranch, the stars emerging as brilliant pinpricks in the vast canvas of the desert sky. The familiar silhouette of his modest 2-room cabin and the adjacent barn provided little comfort as he unsaddled his horse. His mind preoccupied with the day's events, Sheriff Blackwood's warning, Stanton's thinly veiled threats, and the knowledge that his next decision would irreversibly alter multiple lives weighed heavily upon him. As he lit the oil lamp on his rough-hewn table, a soft knock at the door startled him. His hand instinctively moved toward the Winchester propped in the corner, before a familiar voice called out quietly, "James, it is me." He opened the door to find Morning Star standing in the shadows, her presence at his home unprecedented and dangerous in equal measure. "You should not be here," he said urgently, nevertheless stepping aside to let her enter. She moved into the lamplight, her usually composed features tight with concern. "The reservation agent has received orders to relocate our people further west, away from the water sources," she explained without preamble. "My father believes Stanton has bribed officials in Santa Fe to clear the land for his cattle." James ran a hand through his graying hair, connecting this new information with the water rights discussion from earlier. "There's more," Morningstar continued, her dark eyes holding his steadily. "There are rumors in town about us. A man came to the trading post asking questions, describing you, asking about my movements." The implication hung between them, unspoken but clear. Their secret was unraveling, and with it the careful balance both had maintained between their separate worlds. Across town, Lizzie sat alone in her small room above the cafe, a single candle illuminating the letter she had begun and discarded 3 times already. Fletcher's insinuations had unleashed a torrent of emotions: jealousy, disappointment, and a stubborn refusal to believe the worst without evidence. For 4 years, she had interpreted James's quiet courtesy as the reserved nature of a gentleman, his occasional lingering glances as indicators of reciprocated interest, merely awaiting the proper moment for expression. The possibility that his heart belonged elsewhere, especially to a woman from the reservation, challenged not only her romantic hopes, but also the social certainties upon. Yet even as doubt gnawed at her confidence, Lizzie found herself unwilling to condemn him based on malicious gossip, particularly from a source as suspect as William Fletcher. Setting aside her pen, she moved to the window, gazing at the distant mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Tomorrow was Sunday, her only day off from the cafe. Instead of attending church services as usual, she made a decision that would have scandalized the town matrons had they known. She would ride out to James Harrington's ranch and speak with him directly. The impropriety of an unmarried woman calling upon a bachelor without chaperone paled in comparison to the need for clarity that now consumed her. Whatever truth awaited, Lizzie determined she would face it with the same practical courage that had carried her through the loss of her family in a Kansas tornado and the subsequent journey west to forge a new life amid the unforgiving beauty of the Arizona territory. Dawn painted the eastern horizon with pale gold light as Morning Star slipped away from James's ranch, taking a circuitous route back toward the reservation to avoid being seen. Their night together had been spent not in passion, but in urgent planning, weighing impossible choices against inevitable consequences. James watched her disappear into the juniper-covered hills before turning back to prepare for the day ahead. His decision had crystallized sometime in the pre-dawn hours. He would ride to Santa Fe to investigate the relocation orders, leveraging connections from his army days to uncover the truth behind Stanton's machinations. If the cattle baron had indeed corrupted territorial officials, exposing the scheme might protect both the Apache lands and his own ranch from the older man's predatory ambitions. As he saddled his horse, James's thoughts turned briefly to Lizzie Crawford and her gentle attentions. In another life, he might have pursued the comfortable future her warm smile promised. But the frontier had a way of stripping away conventional possibilities, revealing more essential truths beneath social veneers. His path had intertwined with Morning Star's through a series of choices and circumstances that defied easy categorization, creating a bond that transcended the simplistic prejudices of his time. Lost in these reflections, James failed to notice the dust cloud on the horizon, indicating an approaching rider, until the distinctive sound of hoofbeats penetrated his awareness. Lizzie had risen before first light, borrowing a gentle mare from the livery stable owner who had long harbored a fatherly affection for the hard-working Waitress. The early morning ride through the awakening desert had steadied her nerves, the vast landscape putting human concerns into humbling perspective. As she approached James's ranch, the sight of a slender figure disappearing into the distant hills caused her heart to constrict painfully. Even at a distance, the graceful movement and dark hair marked the retreating person unmistakably as a woman, likely a native woman. Fletcher's insinuations crystallized into probable truth. But rather than turning back, Lizzie straightened her spine and continued forward. When she finally reined her horse to a stop outside the cabin, James emerged from the barn, surprise evident in his expression. "Miss Crawford," he greeted her with reflexive courtesy, though his eyes betrayed wariness. "This is unexpected." Lizzie dismounted awkwardly, suddenly aware of the impropriety of her impulsive journey. "Mr. Harrington," she began, her rehearsed speech abandoning her in the face of his direct gaze. That is, there have been rumors in town, and I felt I needed to speak with you directly." James's expression shifted subtly, resignation replacing surprise as he gestured toward the cabin porch. "Perhaps you'd better come sit down," he said quietly. "There are some things I should explain, though I never intended for you to be caught up in this situation." Sheriff Blackwood's Sunday morning routine rarely varied: a solitary breakfast at dawn, followed by a methodical inspection of his firearms and equipment before the town stirred to life. Today, however, that routine was interrupted by the arrival of his Navajo deputy, Charlie Begay, whose normally impassive features were tight with urgency. "Riders heading toward Harrington's place," Begay reported without preamble. "Fletcher, Stanton's foreman Davis, and three hands I don't recognize, armed like they're expecting trouble." Blackwood abandoned his coffee immediately, strapping on his gun belt with practiced efficiency. "Get my horse saddled," he ordered, reaching for his shotgun from the rack behind his desk. Charlie hesitated momentarily. "There's more. The Crawford woman from the cafe rode out that direction at first light, and word from my cousin at the trading post says one of the Apache women, the interpreter they call Morning Star, was seen nearby as well." The implications of this confluence caused Blackwood's weathered face to harden with concern. Stanton's men, two women with competing interests in James Harrington, and the simmering tensions over water rights and reservation boundaries. The mixture was volatile beyond measure. "Send word to Judge Parker in town," the sheriff instructed as he checked his ammunition. "Then find those Apache trackers Harrington sometimes hires. We might need help keeping the peace before this day is through." As his deputy hurried to comply, Blackwood offered a rare, silent prayer that he would reach his friend's ranch before the situation exploded beyond containment. Inside James's cabin, an extraordinary conversation unfolded between the rancher and the Waitress, marked by painful honesty on both sides. "I never meant to mislead you, Miss Crawford," James explained, his usual reserve giving way to forthright clarity. "Your kindness has meant more to me than you know, but my heart has traveled a path I neither expected nor sought." Lizzie's eyes glistened with unshed tears, though her voice remained steady as she replied, "The woman I saw leaving, she's from the reservation, isn't she? The one Mr. Fletcher called your entanglement." James's jaw tightened at Fletcher's characterization. "Her name is Morning Star," he said simply. "She saved my life during the fever 2 winters past, when no doctor would come this far from town. What grew between us afterward was—" He paused, searching for words adequate to describe the profound connection that had transcended cultural boundaries and social prohibitions. Before he could continue, the sound of approaching horses shattered the moment. Moving to the window, James's expression darkened as he recognized the riders. "Miss Crawford, I need you to go into the back room and stay there," he instructed urgently, reaching for his rifle. "William Fletcher and some of Stanton's men are coming, and I doubt it's a social call." Lizzie rose, alarmed but composed. "Mr. Harrington, James, let me stay. Perhaps I can help reason with them." He shook his head firmly. These men aren't interested in reason today. Please, for your own safety." The determination in his eyes brooked no argument, and Lizzie reluctantly withdrew to the indicated room as the riders pulled up outside, their voices carrying clearly through the thin cabin walls. "Harrington!" Fletcher's voice held the artificial projection of a man accustomed to political speech-making. "We need to discuss an urgent community matter." James stepped onto his porch, rifle held casually but visibly at his side, surveying the 5 mounted men arrayed before his cabin. Fletcher sat his horse with the awkward posture of a man who rode only when necessary, while Davis, Stanton's foreman, exuded the dangerous competence of a lifelong frontiersman who had likely killed before. The 3 unknown riders had the hard eyes and practiced gun hands of hired trouble. "Strange delegation for a Sunday morning, Fletcher," James observed calmly, "especially when the community matter appears to involve armed men on my property without invitation." Fletcher's thin lips twisted in a semblance of a smile. "We've received disturbing reports about illegal fraternization with reservation Indians, specifically an Apache woman making regular visits to this ranch. As county commissioner, I'm obligated to investigate potential violations of territorial statutes regarding miscegenation and reservation boundaries." The transparent pretext for harassment might have been almost comical, if not for the deadly serious intentions evident in the men's postures. "My associations are my own business," James replied evenly. "Unless you have a warrant signed by Judge Parker, I suggest you turn around and leave my property." Fletcher's face flushed with anger at the rebuff. "Your insolence merely confirms your guilt, Harrington. Perhaps a search of your premises would yield interesting evidence, or perhaps we should ride to the reservation and question this Apache woman directly." The thinly veiled threat caused James's finger to tighten imperceptibly, tension crackling in the air like the static before a lightning strike. The confrontation's trajectory toward violence was interrupted by the distant sound of galloping hooves approaching from the direction of town. All heads turned to see Sheriff Blackwood riding hard toward the assembled group, his badge catching the morning sunlight. Fletcher's expression soured further at this unwelcome complication to his plans. "Sheriff!" he called with forced joviality as Blackwood reined his horse to a stop, dust billowing around them. "You've arrived just in time to assist with an official county investigation." Blackwood's weathered face remained impassive as his gaze swept over the armed men, lingering briefly on the cabin where James stood vigilant. "Funny thing about official investigations, Commissioner," he drawled, his hand resting casually near his holstered peacemaker. "They generally require proper paperwork and legal authority, neither of which I see here." Fletcher spluttered indignantly about his position and duties, but the sheriff cut him off with the hard-earned authority of his office. "What I do see is 5 armed men threatening a property owner on his own land. Now, unless you want to discuss the territorial statutes regarding armed intimidation and abuse of public office, I suggest you gentlemen continue your Sunday elsewhere." Davis, Stanton's foreman, leaned forward in his saddle. "This ain't over, Harrington," he growled. "The boss doesn't take kindly to being crossed, and that Apache woman won't have a badge to hide behind." The barely concealed threat hung in the air as Fletcher reluctantly signaled the group to withdraw, their hostile glances promising future retribution. As the dust from the departing riders settled, Sheriff Blackwood dismounted and approached the cabin porch where James still stood, rifle in hand. "You're playing a dangerous game, my friend," the sheriff observed quietly. "Stanton doesn't forgive those who stand in his way, and mixing in reservation business only gives him more ammunition." James finally lowered his weapon, the tension in his shoulders easing incrementally. "It's more complicated than you know, Tom," he replied, glancing briefly toward the cabin door. "And I'm afraid I've dragged others into the situation." Before he could elaborate, the door opened behind him, revealing Lizzie Crawford's presence. The sheriff's eyebrows rose in surprise as she stepped onto the porch, her normally neat appearance somewhat disheveled from the morning's events. Miss Crawford, Blackwood acknowledged with careful neutrality. This is unexpected. Lizzie lifted her chin slightly, meeting his gaze directly. I came to speak with Mr. Harrington about certain rumors in town, she explained with quiet dignity. It seems we have more immediate concerns now. The sheriff's expression softened with something like sympathy as he took in the situation. The waitress's obvious feelings for James, the rancher's divided loyalties, and the gathering storm of Stanton's retribution hanging over them all. Indeed we do, he agreed grimly. And I suspect we haven't seen the last of Fletcher and his associates today. We need to consider our next steps carefully. Inside the cabin, an unlikely council of war assembled around James's rough-hewn table. The rancher, the sheriff, and the waitress, each bringing different perspectives to the unfolding crisis. Stanton's been buying territorial officials for years, Blackwood explained, accepting a cup of coffee from Lizzie. But this water rights scheme is ambitious even for him. If he can force the Apache relocation and acquire your property, he'll control nearly every water source in the county. James nodded grimly, his thoughts turning to Morning Star and her people. She told me about the relocation orders last night. The timing's too perfect to be coincidence. Lizzie, who had listened silently to this exchange, finally spoke. Mr. Fletcher mentioned something to me about the reservoir project at the cafe yesterday. Said it would transform the economic prospects of select landowners once the indigenous obstacles were addressed. Her precise recall of Fletcher's euphemisms drew appreciative glances from both men. You have quite a memory. Miss Crawford, the sheriff observed. Lizzie smiled thinly. Serving coffee teaches you to listen carefully. People rarely notice the woman pouring their drinks. James's expression shifted as a realization dawned. That gives me an idea, he said slowly. Stanton and Fletcher don't know that you're here, Miss Crawford. They have no reason to suspect you're anything but the uninterested party they assume. Blackwood caught his meaning immediately. Information gathering? He nodded approvingly. If Miss Crawford is willing, she might hear things in town that could help us expose their scheme. Lizzie straightened, a new sense of purpose replacing her earlier emotional turmoil. I'm willing, she affirmed without hesitation. But what about the Apache woman, Morning Star? She's in danger too. The conversation paused at the sound of horses approaching, not the thunderous arrival of Stanton's men returning, but the measured pace of riders who weren't attempting concealment. James moved to the window, rifle ready, then relaxed visibly. It's Charlie Begay and 2 Apache men, he reported to the others. Sheriff Blackwood nodded in satisfaction as he joined James at the window. I sent Charlie to find those trackers you sometimes hire. Thought we might need the extra eyes. As the 3 riders dismounted outside, James recognized Morning Star's father, Grey Wolf, among them. The respected medicine man's presence at his ranch, an unprecedented development that signaled the gravity of the situation. Introductions were made with the careful formality of people from different worlds finding common cause in shared danger. Grey Wolf's weathered face remained impassive as he assessed the cramped cabin and its occupants, his gaze lingering briefly on Lizzie before settling on James. My daughter speaks of you as a man who keeps his word, he stated in carefully accented English. We will soon see if her judgment is sound. The blunt assessment hung in the air momentarily before Blackwood redirected the conversation to practical matters. Grey Wolf brings word that Stanton's men have been seen near the reservation boundaries, the sheriff explained. And there's more. Judge Parker received a telegraph from Santa Fe confirming that the relocation orders were processed through irregular channels, with significant financial incentives changing hands. James exchanged glances with the sheriff, the pieces of Stanton's corrupt scheme falling into place. So we have proof of bribery, he said thoughtfully, but we need to move quickly before Fletcher realizes the judge is investigating. The strategy that emerged from their council combined the diverse knowledge and skills of each participant. Charlie Begay and the Apache trackers would monitor Stanton's movements and provide early warning of any approach to either the ranch or the reservation. Sheriff Blackwood would return to town to coordinate with Judge Parker, gathering the legal documentation needed to challenge the relocation orders and possibly bring charges against Fletcher for corruption and abuse of office. Lizzie would resume her duties at the cafe the following day, her unassuming position allowing her to gather intelligence from the conversations of Stanton's associates who frequently dined there. James and Grey Wolf would ride to a meeting point where Morning Star waited with evidence she had secretly copied from the reservation agent's correspondence, documents that would further implicate Stanton and Fletcher in the fraudulent scheme. As the group prepared to disperse to their various assignments, an unexpected moment of clarity occurred between Lizzie and James in the privacy of the cabin's small kitchen. "I won't pretend this isn't painful," she admitted quietly, her hands busy wrapping biscuits for his journey. "But I've never been one to wallow in might-have-beens. Your heart has chosen its path." James regarded her with genuine admiration for her fortitude. "You deserve far better than the complications I've brought into your life, Miss Crawford," he responded. Lizzie's smile held a touch of wistfulness as she replied, "Life on the frontier isn't about getting what we deserve. Mr. Harrington, it's about finding the courage to face what comes our way. Now go find your Apache woman and put an end to Stanton's schemes. I'll do my part in town." The next 3 days unfolded in a carefully orchestrated campaign against Elijah Stanton's corrupt ambitions. Judge Parker, armed with the evidence Morning Star had provided and further documentation from Santa Fe, issued formal injunctions against both the Apache relocation orders and any attempt to seize James's property. Sheriff Blackwood served these papers personally to a visibly shocked William Fletcher, whose political instincts for self-preservation quickly overcame his loyalty to his father-in-law. Offered leniency in exchange for testimony, Fletcher provided detailed accounts of Stanton's bribery network extending to territorial officials. Lizzie, meanwhile, maintained her unassuming presence at the cafe, where Stanton's increasingly agitated conversations with his associates yielded additional information about hidden financial transactions and planned intimidation tactics. The cattle baron, sensing the walls closing in around his scheme, made a desperate final move, dispatching Davis and his hired guns to ambush James as he returned from the reservation. The attempt might have succeeded if not for the vigilance of the Apache trackers, who spotted the would-be assassins in time to warn their target. The ensuing gunfight near Rattlesnake Ridge left Davis dead and 2 of his associates wounded and awaiting the judicial reckoning that would surely follow their recovery. By week's end, Elijah Stanton found himself in a position entirely foreign to his experience, defending himself against multiple criminal charges before a judge unsympathetic to his usual methods of persuasion. The evidence against him proved insurmountable, and the cattle baron's empire began to crumble as associates hastened to distance themselves from his disgrace. With the immediate threat neutralized, James, Morning Star, and the other principals in the drama gathered one final time at the hidden spring beyond Rattlesnake Ridge, neutral ground that belonged to neither settlement nor reservation, but represented the possibility of common ground between worlds. Sheriff Blackwood summed up the territorial governor's response to the exposed corruption. The fraudulent relocation orders had been rescinded, water rights for both the Apache lands and James's ranch would be legally protected, and several officials in Santa Fe now faced their own legal reckonings. Grey Wolf listened to this recitation with the measured skepticism of one who had witnessed too many broken promises, but acknowledged that this particular battle, at least, had ended justly. The most surprising development came from Lizzie Crawford, who announced her decision to sell her interest in the cafe and accept a position as assistant to Judge Parker, her intelligence and attention to detail having impressed the jurist during their collaboration. As dusk settled over the desert landscape, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain, James and Morning Star stood slightly apart from the others, their future as uncertain as it was full of possibility. The people in town will never fully accept what lies between us, James acknowledged quietly, watching the fading sunlight play across her features. And your place among your people will be complicated by your connection to me. Morning Star's gaze remained steady as she considered his words. The path between two worlds is never easy, she replied, but it is sometimes necessary. My father believes that change comes whether we welcome it or not. Our choice lies in how we meet it. In the distance, Sheriff Blackwood and Lizzie were mounting their horses for the ride back to Cottonwood Springs, while Grey Wolf and the other Apache men had already departed toward the reservation. The unlikely alliance formed against Stanton's corruption had succeeded, but the deeper barriers between their separate societies remained largely intact, challenged but not overthrown by their temporary cooperation. As twilight deepened toward night, James and Morning Star faced the future with the clear-eyed realism of people who understood the obstacles before them, yet chose to move forward together despite them. The Arizona desert stretched around them, harsh and beautiful in equal measure, much like the truth they had embraced and the path they had chosen. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.